Welcome to the channel Stories of Slavery. Today's story takes us to Pennsylvania, 1869, and to Eliza Brown, an enslaved girl on a plantation who discovers something in the ground that could change everything. Oil. For a moment, it looks like fate has finally opened a door. But what happens next is the kind of turning point that makes your stomach drop. Because the worst doesn't come from the land, it comes from people. This is a difficult and intense story, so take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. The night of March 14, 1869 arrived at the Miller property with a heavy silence, the kind that seems to swallow even the sound of the wind. Eliza Brown was kneeling on the packed dirt floor of the main house basement, her calloused hands scraping rotten corn kernels that served as pig feed. 17 years of life, 4 years after Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and she still wore chains around her ankles. The freedom that Lincoln promised on January 1, 1863 never reached that forgotten corner of rural Pennsylvania. While the country rebuilt itself after the bloodiest war in its history, while freed families migrated north, seeking opportunities in cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, Eliza remained trapped in a legal limbo that only existed because no one cared enough to investigate. The Millers called it an inherited debt. When Eliza's mother died of pneumonia in the winter of 1867, Thomas Miller, the patriarch of the family, presented a fabricated document claiming that the woman owed the equivalent of $800 in unpaid labor costs, food, and shelter accumulated over 20 years. The paper was false, written in Miller's own hand just days after the burial. But who would believe a black girl over a white landowner? In Crawford County, Pennsylvania, where most folks still sympathized with the Confederate cause despite fighting for the Union, the word of men like Thomas Miller was law. Eliza knew the truth. Her mother had been born free in Philadelphia, daughter of a seamstress and a dock worker. She'd been kidnapped in 1845 while traveling to visit relatives in Erie, sold to a trafficker who specialized in capturing free blacks and reselling them in states where questions weren't asked. The Miller family bought her for $300 at an illegal auction in Ohio, and from that day forward, her freedom certificate meant nothing. What kept Eliza breathing, what kept her heart beating despite the chains and humiliation was Toby, her little brother, 9 years old, with eyes that still held something Eliza had lost years ago. Hope. Toby believed that one day they would walk out that gate. He believed that justice existed somewhere beyond the property line. Eliza had stopped believing in justice, but she believed in Toby's smile, and that was enough to keep her going. The Miller property sprawled across 240 acres of Pennsylvania wilderness, most of it untouched forest and swampland, considered worthless. The main house was a two-story structure built in 1831 with white columns that pretended at Southern elegance but couldn't hide the rot in the wooden boards. Thomas Miller, 63 years old, ruled the place with the authority of someone who had never been challenged. His wife Margaret was a thin woman with a permanent expression of disgust, as if the mere existence of people like Eliza contaminated the air she breathed. But it was the youngest son, Robert Miller, 22 years old, who represented the most dangerous kind of cruelty, the kind that hides behind a friendly smile. Robert had returned from the war in 1865 with a limp in his left leg and a medal for bravery at Gettysburg. He spoke softly, read poetry, and had even taught Eliza to read in secret during the winter of 1868, bringing her books hidden under his coat. Eliza had made the mistake of thinking this meant he saw her as human. On the morning of March 15th, Thomas Miller woke Eliza before dawn. The sun hadn't yet risen, and the March cold still bit at exposed skin. He handed her a shovel, a pickaxe, and a rusted bucket. "There's a section near the eastern swamp that needs drainage," he said, not looking at her face. He never looked directly at her. "Dig a channel from the high ground to the low marsh. I want it done by nightfall." It was punishment work. The eastern swamp was 3 miles from the main house, through forest thick with thorns and mud that could swallow a person up to their knees. The task would take 3 strong men a full week. Miller was giving her 1 day because he wanted to see her fail. Wanted an excuse to withhold food or add more time to the imaginary debt. Eliza took the tools without a word. Speaking only gave them more reasons to hit you. The walk to the eastern swamp took 90 minutes. Toby walked beside her for the first mile, carrying a canteen of water and a piece of hard bread wrapped in cloth. The boy talked about everything and nothing. telling her about a robin's nest he'd found near the barn, about how he'd been practicing his letters by writing in the dirt with a stick. "One day I'm going to write our story," Toby said, his voice bright with conviction. "I'm going to write it down so everybody knows what happened here, so nobody can pretend it didn't." Eliza felt something break inside her chest. "Don't waste your time with dreams, Toby. Dreams are for people who have a future." The boy stopped walking. His small hand grabbed hers, and when she looked down, his eyes were fierce. "We got a future, Eliza? We do. You just got to believe it." She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to. When they reached the point where Toby had to turn back toward the house, Eliza watched him disappear between the trees. She didn't know it then, but that image, her little brother walking away with his shoulders straight and his head high, would become the last good memory she had of him alive. The eastern swamp was exactly as miserable as she expected. The ground was soft, covered in a layer of rotting vegetation that released a sulfurous smell with every step. Stagnant water pulled in irregular patches, reflecting the gray sky like broken mirrors. The trees here grew twisted and stunted, their roots exposed like the bones of ancient creatures. Eliza began to dig where the ground seemed firmest, near a slight rise the miller had probably identified as the starting point for the drainage channel. The work was brutal. Each shovelful of dirt weighed heavy with moisture, and the soft earth kept sliding back into the hole she created. Within an hour, her back screamed with pain. Within 2 hours, her hands bled from fresh blisters layered over old calluses. But Eliza had learned long ago how to separate her mind from her body. While her muscles worked mechanically, her thoughts drifted to a place Miller couldn't touch. She thought about her grandmother, the woman she'd only known through her mother's stories. A woman born in West Africa, stolen at age 14, who survived the Middle Passage and 28 years of slavery before dying in a Maryland tobacco field. Her mother said the grandmother had a gift. She could read the land. She could tell where water flowed underground, where crops would grow strongest, where the earth held secrets. "The land speaks if you know how to listen," her mother had whispered to her once. Your grandmother could hear it sing. Eliza had always dismissed it as superstition, the kind of folklore that enslaved people clung to when reality offered nothing but despair. But as she dug deeper into the Pennsylvania soil, 3 feet down now, something changed. The smell hit her first, not the rotting vegetation she'd grown accustomed to, but something chemical, sharp, pungent. It reminded her of the lamps they burned in the main house, but stronger, raw. Then she noticed the water seeping into her hole wasn't clear. It had a rainbow sheen, like oil floating on the surface of a puddle, but thicker. Much thicker. Eliza stopped digging. She crouched down and dipped her fingers into the liquid pooling at the bottom of her excavation. The substance was viscous, dark brown, almost black. It coated her skin like thick molasses, but didn't have the sweetness. The smell intensified, making her eyes water. She had heard the men in town talking about it. Pennsylvania was in the middle of what newspapers called the oil boom. In 1859, just 10 years earlier, a man named Edwin Drake had drilled the first successful oil well in Titusville, about 60 miles north of where Eliza now knelt. The discovery transformed the state. Fortunes were made overnight. Crude oil sold for $20 a barrel in 1860, and though the price had dropped to around $3 by 1869, the demand was insatiable. Oil meant kerosene for lamps. It meant lubricants for the machines driving America's industrial revolution. It meant money. Enormous, life-changing money. Eliza's heart began to pound. She dug faster, ignoring the pain in her hands, 6 in deeper, and the substance wasn't just seeping anymore. It was flowing, a small but steady stream of crude oil pushing up from some underground reservoir she couldn't see but could feel. The ground beneath her seemed alive, pressurized, like it was holding its breath. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "The land speaks if you know how to listen." For the first time in 4 years, Eliza allowed herself to feel something dangerous. Hope. She understood immediately what this meant. If there was oil here on Miller's property, and if she could prove it, if she could somehow claim it or trade it, she could buy their freedom. No court in Pennsylvania would let Miller keep them enslaved if she had money. Money changed everything. Money made you human in the eyes of the law. But she also understood the risk. As she told Miller directly, he would simply take the discovery and bury her in the same hole to keep her quiet. She needed leverage. She needed proof that she'd found it first. Needed witnesses, needed something that would force Miller to negotiate rather than simply eliminate her. The sun was setting by the time Eliza filled the hole back in carefully, leaving no obvious sign of what lay beneath. She smoothed the dirt, scattered leaves and debris over the disturbed earth, committed the exact location to memory, using the surrounding trees as markers. A lightning struck oak 40 paces north, a cluster of 3 birch trees to the east, a boulder shaped like a crouching bear to the west. She walked back to the main house in darkness, her mind racing through possibilities. She thought about running, taking Toby and fleeing north to Canada, where slavery had been abolished decades ago. But winter had barely released its grip on Pennsylvania. They would freeze to death before reaching the border, assuming they didn't get caught first. Slave catchers still operated in 1869, rebranded as bounty hunters looking for people who'd broken labor contracts. She thought about going to the authorities in Melville, the county seat, but what would she say? A black girl accusing a white landowner of illegal enslavement would be laughed out of the sheriff's office if she wasn't arrested for making false accusations. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery, but it hadn't abolished racism. Pennsylvania might have been a Union state, but Crawford County had more than its share of copperheads. Northerners who sympathized with the South and resented the federal government's interference in what they called states' rights. Then she thought of Robert Miller. It was a gamble, a terrible, dangerous gamble. But Robert was different from his father. Hadn't he taught her to read? Hadn't he spoken to her like she was a person with thoughts worth hearing? He was young, educated at Dickinson College before the war. He'd fought to preserve the Union. Maybe, just maybe, he still believed in the principles he fought for. Eliza made her decision. 3 days later, on March 18th, she approached Robert Miller in the barn where he was inspecting a lame horse. The building smelled of hay and animal warmth, and late afternoon sunlight streamed through gaps in the wooden walls, cutting the shadows into geometric patterns. "Mr. Furt, Robert," she said quietly, "I need to speak with you privately. It's important." Robert looked up from the horse's hoof, surprise crossing his handsome face. He had his father's sharp features, but his mother's blue eyes and a gentleness in his expression that seemed out of place in a family like the Millers. "What is it, Eliza?" He set down the horse's leg and wiped his hands on his trousers. She glanced around, making sure they were alone. "I found something on the eastern property, something valuable." His eyebrows rose. "Valuable? How?" Eliza took a breath. This was the moment. Once she spoke, there was no taking it back. "Oil. Crude oil. Not just a little, a lot. I think there's a reservoir under the eastern swamp." Robert's expression changed in an instant. The gentleness vanished, replaced by something sharp and calculating. "Show me." They walked to the eastern swamp together, Robert moving quickly despite his war injury. Eliza led him to the exact spot, showed him the markers, and dug with her hands until the oil began to seep through. Robert crouched down, examined the substance, smelled it, rubbed it between his fingers. His face was unreadable. "This is significant," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "How long have you known?" 3 days. "And you told no one else?" "No one?" Robert stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and looked at her directly for the first time since they'd left the barn. "Why are you telling me, Eliza?" This was it. The pitch, the negotiation, the moment that would determine everything. "Because I want to make a deal," Eliza said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "I give you the location. I show you exactly where to drill. I help you prove the claim and establish the well. And in return, you give me and Toby our freedom papers, legal, notarized official papers that we can take to any court in America. We walk away free, and you become a rich man. Everybody wins." Robert stared at her for a long moment. Then slowly he smiled. It was the same warm smile he'd given her when teaching her to read, the smile that had made her think he might be different. "That's a very clever proposition, Eliza," he said softly. "Very clever indeed." Something in his tone made her stomach drop. "But there's a problem with your logic." Robert continued, stepping closer. "You seem to think you have something to negotiate with. You don't. This is Miller land. Everything on it, under it, or growing from it, belongs to my family, including you, including whatever you find." Eliza backed away, but Robert grabbed her wrist. Not violently, but firmly, like you'd hold a dog that might run. "Did you really think I saw you as an equal?" he asked, and there was something like pity in his voice. "I taught you to read because I was bored, Because it amused me to see if it was even possible to educate your kind. You were a project, Eliza, an experiment, nothing more. The betrayal was absolute. It wasn't the physical pain of his grip, it was the death of the last small hope she'd allowed herself to nurture. She'd been a fool. A stupid, desperate fool. "Please," she whispered. "Please," she whispered. "Please, just let us go. I won't tell anyone. I'll disappear. You'll never see us again." Robert released her wrist and stepped back. "I'll discuss this with my father. Wait here." He walked away, leaving Eliza standing in the swamp as the sun set and the shadows grew long. She should have run then. Should have grabbed Toby and fled into the forest and taken her chances with the cold and the wilderness and the bounty hunters, but she was paralyzed by the magnitude of her mistake, by the realization that she'd handed the Millers exactly what they needed to destroy her. Robert returned an hour later with his father, his older brother William, and 2 men Eliza recognized from town. They brought lanterns, surveying equipment, and rifles. Thomas Miller examined the oil seepage with the cold efficiency of a man evaluating livestock. He asked questions, took measurements, had his sons dig deeper to confirm the flow. The crude oil came faster, pooling in the expanding hole, reflecting the lantern light like liquid night. "It's real," Thomas said finally. "This could be a significant reserve." He turned to look at Eliza, and in his eyes she saw her death sentence. "The girl's a problem," William Miller said. He was the oldest son, 30 years old, with his father's cruelty, but none of Robert's sophistication. "She knows too much. If word gets out that she found, it could complicate the claim." "There's also the boy," Robert added quietly. "They talk. She'll tell him everything." Thomas nodded slowly, considering we need to secure the property, file the mineral rights claim tomorrow, but first, we handled the loose ends. One of the men from town, a heavy-set man with a thick beard, spat tobacco juice onto the ground. "This is why I didn't free mine when Lincoln made his proclamation." They caused nothing but trouble. Eliza felt the night closing in around her. "Please," she said again, hating the weakness in her voice. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said anything. Please, just forget I was here." Thomas Miller pulled a pistol from his belt. "Bring the boy." The world stopped. "No," Eliza screamed. "No, he doesn't know anything. He's just a child. Please, God, please." She ran toward Thomas, and William hit her across the face with the back of his hand, sending her sprawling into the mud. The taste of blood filled her mouth. "Go get the boy," Thomas repeated, this time to Robert. Robert hesitated for just a moment, and Eliza saw something flicker across his face. Doubt, regret, but whatever it wasn't strong enough to stop him. He nodded and walked back toward the house. Eliza lay in the mud, sobbing as the minutes stretched into eternity. When Robert returned, Toby was with him, looking confused and frightened. The boy's eyes found Eliza, and his expression shattered. "Liza!" His voice was small. "What's happening?" "Look away, Toby," Eliza begged. "Please, baby, look away." But Toby didn't look away. He stood there 9 years old, trying to be brave, trying to understand why these men he'd worked for, served, obeyed, were looking at him like he was something that needed to be disposed of. Thomas Miller raised his pistol. The shot echoed across the swamp like thunder. Toby's small body crumpled to the ground. Eliza's scream tore from somewhere beyond her throat, beyond her lungs, beyond her body entirely. It was a sound that came from the breaking of something fundamental, the destruction of the last piece of herself that had remained intact. She crawled through the mud to her brother's body, pulled him into her arms, felt his blood soak into her dress. His eyes were still open, still holding that hope she'd tried so hard to protect, but now it was fading, dimming like a candle in the wind. "I'm sorry," she whispered against his cooling forehead. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry, Toby. I'm so sorry." Toby died in her arms without making a sound. They let her hold him for exactly 5 minutes. Then William pulled her away, and Robert and the townsmen dragged Toby's body into the forest. She never found out where they buried him. They chained Eliza in the basement of the main house that night. The chains were heavy, old iron meant for farm animals, bolted into a support beam that held up the entire structure. There was a bucket for waste, a pile of moldy straw for sleeping, and nothing else. No window, no light except what crept through the gaps in the floorboards above. Thomas Miller came down the next morning with a contract written in his own hand. It stated that Eliza Brown had voluntarily agreed to work in the Miller family's new petroleum extraction operation for a period of 15 years in exchange for room and board. "Sign it," he said, placing the paper and a pen on the dirt floor in front of her. "I can't write," Eliza lied. Thomas smiled. "Robert told me he taught you. Sign it, or I'll find every other black family within 50 miles and burn them out. I'll make them pay for your stubbornness." She signed with a shaking hand, her brother's blood still under her fingernails. Over the following weeks, Eliza watched from her chains as the Miller property transformed. Thomas filed the mineral rights claim with Crawford County on March 20th, listing himself as the sole discoverer of the oil reserve. By April, he'd secured financing from investors in Pittsburgh, eager to capitalize on Pennsylvania's black gold. By May, drilling equipment arrived, massive wooden dirks that towered over the forest like skeletal giants. They brought in workers, rough men who cared nothing about the source of their wages. They built shacks and storage buildings. They cleared the swamp and turned Eliza's discovery into an industrial site that operated day and night, the sound of machinery drowning out bird song. And every day, Thomas Miller brought Eliza up from the basement to work. She hauled water. She operated pumps. She cleaned the thick, toxic sludge that accumulated around the drilling site. The work was brutal. But it wasn't the physical pain that destroyed her. It was watching them profit from the discovery she'd made. Watching them build an empire on Toby's grave. The girl who'd hoped for freedom died in that basement. Something else took her place. At night, alone in the darkness, Eliza began to listen, not to the sounds of the house above her or the distant drilling equipment. She listened to the land itself, the way her grandmother had taught her mother, the way her mother had tried to teach her, and slowly, gradually, the land began to speak. It told her things the Miller family didn't know. It told her that the oil reservoir wasn't stable, that the pressure was building faster than they understood, that their drilling methods were creating fractures in the rock formations that would eventually lead to catastrophic failure. The experienced oil workers knew to monitor pressure carefully to install safety valves and relief systems. But Thomas Miller was cheap and impatient. He cut corners. He pushed harder and faster, trying to maximize extraction before the investors demanded accounting. Eliza began to understand that the oil wasn't just a resource. It was a weapon, a massive pressurized weapon sitting beneath the Miller property, waiting for the right trigger. By June of 1869, the Miller Oil Company was extracting 40 barrels a day. At $3 per barrel, that meant $120 in daily revenue. Thomas Miller was on his way to becoming one of the richest men in Crawford County. He started planning a celebration, a grand party for the 4th of July, exactly 4 months after Toby's murder, where he would invite investors, politicians, and society families from as far as Erie and Pittsburgh. He would show off his success, secure additional financing for expansion, and establish himself as a petroleum baron. Eliza heard them planning it above her head. She heard every detail through the floorboards, the guest list, the menu, the schedule, and she began planning too. They let her out of the basement more frequently now. The constant work needed more hands, and Eliza had proven herself compliant, broken, no longer a threat. She shuffled when she walked, kept her eyes down, spoke only when spoken to, the perfect image of defeated certitude. But in the darkness, she was studying, learning the machinery, understanding the pressure gauges, memorizing the valve systems. The workers treated her like furniture, talking freely in her presence about technical problems, about the dangerously high pressure readings, about the need for better safety equipment that Thomas kept refusing to buy. One night in late June, alone in the basement, Eliza made a decision. She wasn't going to escape. She wasn't going to run to freedom and let the Millers live wealthy and successful lives built on her brother's blood. She was going to take from them what they'd taken from her. Everything. The land whispered its secrets to her in the darkness. It showed her where the pressure was highest. It told her which valves, if adjusted just slightly, would transform controlled extraction into explosive catastrophe. It taught her patience. July 4th, 1869 arrived with perfect summer weather, clear blue skies, warm sun, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and crude oil. The Miller property gleamed with preparation. White tents covered long tables laden with food. A string quartet from Pittsburgh tuned their instruments on a raised platform. Carriages began arriving before noon, bringing men in expensive suits and women in elaborate dresses. Thomas Miller stood at the center of it all, shaking hands and accepting congratulations like a conquering general. He wore a new suit tailored in Philadelphia, dark wool despite the summer heat, with a gold watch chain stretched across his expanding belly. Margaret Miller floated through the crowd in lavender silk, playing the gracious hostess, her earlier pinched expression replaced by the satisfied smile of a woman who'd finally achieved the social standing she believed she deserved. Robert Miller worked the younger crowd, charming the daughters of investors with poetry and war stories, his limp somehow adding to his appeal rather than diminishing it. William stood near the beer barrels, red-faced and loud, telling crude jokes to men who laughed because his father's money demanded it, and Eliza served them all. They'd brought her up from the basement that morning, given her a clean dress, a white apron, and strict instructions. She was to carry trays, pour drinks, clear plates, and remain invisible. Margaret had even attempted to make her presentable, forcing her to wash in cold water and tying her hair back with a strip of cloth. "You will not embarrass this family," Margaret hissed while yanking the cloth tight enough to hurt. "You will be grateful for the opportunity to serve your betters. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Eliza had replied, her voice flat and obedient. What Margaret didn't see was the darkness behind Eliza's eyes. What none of them saw was that the broken girl they thought they controlled had transformed into something far more dangerous than they could imagine. The celebration officially began at 2 in the afternoon. Thomas Miller stood on the platform where the musicians had been playing and called for silence. The crowd of approximately 80 guests gathered around, champagne glasses in hand, faces flushed with alcohol and summer heat. "Friends, colleagues, distinguished guests," Thomas began, his voice booming with confidence. "4 months ago, this property was nothing more than untamed wilderness, unproductive swampland that my father, God rest his soul, had the misfortune to inherit. But the Lord works in mysterious ways, and what appeared to be worthless ground has revealed itself to be a treasure beyond our wildest dreams." The crowd murmured, appreciation. Someone shouted, "Here, here," Thomas continued, warming to his performance. "Through careful survey and modern scientific methods, we discovered beneath our feet one of the richest petroleum deposits in all of Pennsylvania. The Miller Oil Company is now producing 40 barrels per day, and our geologists believe we've barely scratched the surface. Within 5 years, I predict we'll be extracting 200 barrels daily. Within 10 years, we'll rival the production of Titusville itself." Applause erupted. Men raised their glasses. Thomas Miller, a mediocre farmer who'd struggled his entire life, was being celebrated as a visionary. Eliza watched from the edge of the crowd, a tray of empty glasses in her hands. She watched Thomas lie about how he discovered the oil. She watched investors congratulate him on his brilliance. She watched Robert accept praise for managing the drilling operation. She watched them build their legend on Toby's unmarked grave. Something inside her, the last fragment that might have hesitated, turned to stone. And so Thomas concluded, raising his own glass high, "I propose a toast to American ingenuity, to Pennsylvania Petroleum, to the Miller Oil Company, and to the prosperity that flows as freely as the crude oil beneath our feet." "To Miller Oil," the crowd shouted in unison. They drank deeply, unaware that the ground beneath their expensive shoes was already beginning to tremble. Eliza had made her moves over the previous 72 hours. The workers operated the drilling equipment in shifts round the clock, and they'd grown so accustomed to her presence that she'd become background noise. On the night of July 1st, while the evening shift workers were distracted by a card game in their bunkhouse, Eliza had adjusted 3 critical pressure relief valves at the main derrick, not closed completely, which would have been obvious, but partially restricted, enough to increase pressure gradually without triggering immediate alarms. On July the 2nd, she'd loosened several bolts on the primary containment tank, creating microscopic gaps that would widen under increased pressure. The work took her 4 hours, done in complete darkness, her fingers working by feel alone. She'd learned metalwork by watching the maintenance crews, absorbing every detail, the way she'd absorbed reading from Robert's lessons. On July 3rd, the day before the celebration, she'd created a small but critical modification to the main pressure gauge, causing it to read 15% lower than actual pressure levels. The drillers thought everything was operating within normal parameters. In reality, the pressure had been building to catastrophic levels for 72 hours. The land had whispered exactly what to do. Her grandmother's gift, passed through blood and suffering, had shown her how to turn the Millers' greed into their destruction. Now, as the celebration continued into the late afternoon, Eliza calculated timing. The sun would set around 18:15. The main fireworks display was scheduled for 900, a grand finale to cap the day's festivities, but Eliza had her own fireworks planned, and they would begin much sooner. At 6 times, As the guests moved from appetizers to the main dinner service, Eliza volunteered to check the oil dirks. It wasn't unusual. Someone had to monitor the equipment constantly, and the regular workers were enjoying the holiday, drinking beer provided by Thomas Miller's newfound generosity. William Miller, barely sober himself, waved her away without interest. Eliza walked across the property toward the main drilling site, moving with the shuffling gait of the defeated, her shoulders hunched, her eyes downcast. But the moment she passed beyond the site of the celebration, her posture changed. Her back straightened, her pace quickened, her eyes lifted sharp and focused. The main derrick towered 70 feet above the Pennsylvania forest. A wooden structure that groaned and creaked with the pressure of the petroleum reservoir it was attempting to control. The drilling site itself was a nightmare of industrial progress. A square acre of cleared land covered in oil-soaked mud, discarded equipment, and storage tanks that smelled of chemicals and profit. 3 workers were supposed to be monitoring the operation, but Eliza found only one, a young man named Patterson, who was more interested in a bottle of whiskey than the pressure gauges. He barely glanced up when she approached. "Just checking everything's running smooth for Mr. Miller," Eliza said softly. Patterson waved a hand dismissively. "It's all fine. Been fine all day. You can tell Miller his precious oil is flowing like money." Eliza nodded and moved deeper into the site toward the tangle of pipes and valves that controlled the flow from underground to the storage tanks. She knelt beside one of the valves she'd adjusted 3 days earlier, pulled a wrench from where she'd hidden it beneath a pile of rags, and gave it a final turn. The change was immediate but subtle. The sound of the flowing oil shifted from a steady gurgle to a higher-pitched hiss. Somewhere deep underground, pressure that had been building for days found one less avenue of escape. Patterson didn't notice. He was singing to himself some Irish drinking song his grandfather had probably taught him. Eliza moved to the second valve and repeated the process, then the third. With each adjustment, the pressure increased. The derrick began to vibrate, a low thrumming that you could feel in your bones if you knew what to listen for. "Hey, girl," Patterson called out. "You almost done? I gotta take a piss." "Almost," Eliza replied. She looked at the young man, probably 19 years old, someone's son, someone who'd never done anything to her personally, but who took wages built on murder. She made a decision. "You know what? You should go check the southern storage tank. I heard one of the workers mention it might be leaking." Patterson frowned. "Nobody told me about a leak." "Probably nothing," Eliza said, "but Mr. Miller would be real unhappy if good oil was seeping into the ground on his big celebration day. Better safe than sorry." The appeal to avoiding Miller's anger worked. Patterson stood, swayed slightly, and headed toward the southern tank, which was positioned a quarter-mile away beyond the treen, far enough to be safe from what was coming. Eliza waited until he disappeared into the forest. Then she moved quickly to the main pressure gauge, the one she'd modified to read false levels. Using a small knife she'd stolen from the kitchen, she carefully removed the modification, allowing the gauge to show actual pressure for the first time in 3 days. The needle jumped from green safety zone into deep red danger zone. If Patterson had been watching, alarms would have been raised immediately. Emergency protocols would have engaged, but Patterson was stumbling through the forest looking for a non-existent leak. And Eliza was alone with a ticking bomb that had been building explosive potential for 72 hours. She could hear her grandmother's voice in the creaking of the derrick, in the hissing of overpressured petroleum, and the trembling of the earth beneath her feet. The land was screaming now, warning everyone with ears to hear that something terrible was about to happen. Back at the celebration, no one heard anything except music and laughter. Eliza walked back toward the main house, her heart hammering but her face calm. She had approximately 30 minutes, maybe 45 if the equipment held longer than she calculated, 30 minutes to position all the pieces exactly where she needed them. She found Margaret Miller giving orders to the kitchen staff, her voice sharp with stress, disguised as authority. "The roasted duck needs more garnish. And where are the extra bottles of French wine?" Thomas ordered. "They should have been chilled hours ago." "Mrs. Miller," Eliza said quietly. "Mr. Miller, Thomas asked me to fetch something from the main house. Said it was in his study. He needs it for the toast later." Margaret barely looked at her. "Fine. Be quick about it, and don't touch anything you're not supposed to." Eliza entered the house through the back entrance, climbed the stairs to the second floor, and went directly to Thomas Miller's study. The room smelled of cigar smoke and leather. An enormous desk dominated the space, covered in papers, maps, and financial documents. Eliza had cleaned this room 100 times. She knew exactly where Thomas kept his important papers. She found the mineral rights claim in the third drawer, the official document that gave the Miller family legal ownership of all petroleum deposits on the property. Next to it was the false contract she'd been forced to sign, the one claiming she'd agreed to 15 years of labor. And beneath that, a ledger showing the oil company's finances, profits that were already approaching $50,000. Eliza took the mineral rights claim and the false contract. She left the ledger. Money didn't matter anymore. She folded the documents carefully and tucked them into the pocket she'd sewn into her dress specifically for this purpose. Then she went to Thomas Miller's liquor cabinet and selected a bottle of his most expensive brandy, a French import that he'd been saving for special occasions. She uncorked it and poured the amber liquid in a trail across the expensive Persian rug over the leather chairs along the wooden bookshelves filled with volumes Thomas had never read, but displayed for prestige. The brandy would catch fire beautifully, but not yet. Timing was everything. Eliza descended the stairs and exited through the front door this time, walking past guests who didn't even see her. She was a shadow, a ghost, already dead in their eyes. So why would they notice her movements? She found Toby's grave 3 weeks after they'd killed him. It had taken careful observation, watching where Robert and William had walked that night, following the disturbed earth to a spot deep in the forest where they'd buried him in an unmarked shallow hole like he was nothing, like he was trash. Eliza had visited the grave every night she could, whenever they let her out of the basement for late work shifts. She'd cleared away debris, placed stones in a careful circle, whispered apologies and promises into the dark earth. Now she knelt beside the grave one final time, her hand pressed against the dirt that covered her brother's small body. "I'm sorry I couldn't save you," she whispered. "I'm sorry I was stupid enough to trust them, but I promise you this, Toby. I promise they're going to pay every single one of them. The people who pulled the trigger and the people who stood by and watched, and the people who came here today to celebrate money built on your blood. I'm going to take everything from them like they took everything from us." The earth seemed to pulse beneath her palm. The land was ready. Eliza stood, brushed dirt from her dress, and walked back toward the celebration. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked almost like fire. The guests were gathering for dinner, filling the long tables under the white tents, their faces glowing with contentment and entitlement. At 7:15, exactly as Eliza had calculated, the first warning sign appeared. One of the workers who'd been drinking near the derricks came running toward the celebration, his face pale, his movements uncoordinated with panic. "Mr. Miller," he shouted. "Mr. Miller," he shouted. "Sir, there's something wrong with the main derrick. The pressure gauge is showing critical levels." Thomas Miller set down his fork, irritation crossing his face. "What are you talking about? Patterson is monitoring the equipment. He would have reported any problems." "Patterson ain't there, sir, and the gauge is deep in the red. I think we might have the explosion cut off the rest of his sentence." It wasn't the derrick itself exploding, not yet. It was one of the storage tanks, the one Eliza had weakened days earlier, finally giving way under the pressure of overfilled petroleum and summer heat. The sound was enormous, a deep bass boom that shook the ground and rattled glasses on the dinner tables. Guests screamed. Women grabbed their husbands. Men jumped to their feet, confusion and alarm spreading like wildfire. A column of black smoke rose above the tree, visible even in the fading daylight. And then the smell hit. Thick crude oil mixed with burning wood. Somewhere in the chaos of the storage tank explosion, a lantern had fallen. Fire and petroleum were meeting for the first time. "Jesus Christ," William Miller whispered, staring at the smoke. Thomas Miller's face went from red to white in an instant. He turned to his sons. "Get everyone away from the drilling site. Move them toward the main house." William organized the men. "We need to fight that fire before it spreads." But Eliza knew what Thomas didn't. The fire wasn't the real problem. The fire was just the opening act. Chaos consumed the celebration. Guests stumbled away from the tables, women struggling in their elaborate dresses, men shouting conflicting orders. Some ran for their carriages, deciding that discretion was better than heroism. Others, particularly the investors who had money tied up in Miller Oil, moved toward the drilling site to assess the damage. Thomas Miller tried to maintain control, bellowing orders, demanding buckets and water and coordinated firefighting efforts, but his voice was lost in the pandemonium. Eliza moved through the chaos like smoke, unnoticed and unremarkable. She made her way to the main house, climbed the back stairs once again, and returned to Thomas Miller's study. The brandy she'd poured earlier had evaporated slightly in the summer heat, but the rug and furniture were still soaked with expensive, highly flammable alcohol. She took a lamp from the hallway, one of the oil lamps, ironically filled with petroleum refined from the very deposits she'd discovered. She opened the glass housing, adjusted the wick to maximum height, and placed it carefully on Thomas Miller's desk, right on top of his precious financial ledgers. Then she tipped it over. The lamp oil spread quickly across the papers. The flame caught, grew, found the brandy-soaked rug. Fire bloomed like a living thing, eager and hungry. Within seconds, the entire study was engulfed. Within a minute, the flames were spreading to the hallway, licking at the expensive wallpaper, climbing toward the third floor. Eliza watched for just a moment, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. Then she descended the stairs one final time and exited through the front door, which he left wide open to create a draft that would feed the flames. Outside, the scene had deteriorated further. The fire from the storage tank had spread to the smaller equipment buildings. Smoke covered the western portion of the property like a dark curtain. Men were running with buckets of water that seemed pathetically inadequate against the scale of the blaze. And then at exactly 7:43 in the evening, the main derrick finally gave way. The explosion was biblical. 72 hours of built-up pressure, thousands of pounds per square, and released in a single catastrophic instant. The wooden derrick disintegrated, transformed from solid structure to splinters and shrapnel in a heartbeat. The crude oil that had been flowing in controlled measures for months erupted like a geyser, shooting 200 feet into the air, a black fountain of compressed petroleum that caught fire the moment it met the flames from the storage tank. The sound was indescribable. Louder than thunder, louder than cannon fire. Loud enough that people in Meeville, 15 mi away, would later report hearing a distant boom and seeing a strange glow on the horizon. The fireball that resulted was visible for 50 mi. It turned night into day, painted the Pennsylvania forest in shades of orange and red that had never existed in nature. The heat was intense enough to ignite trees 100 yards away from the derrick site. People screamed. People ran. People fell to their knees and prayed because it looked like the end of the world. Thomas Miller stood frozen, staring at the destruction of everything he'd stolen. His face reflected the firelight, his mouth opening and closing with no sound emerging. The oil that was supposed to make him a baron, that was supposed to elevate him to wealth and respect, was now consuming his property with apocalyptic fury. Margaret Miller collapsed, her lavender dress pooling around her like a broken flower. She was making a high keening sound, something between a scream and a sob. Robert Miller was running toward the flames, limping badly, shouting for the workers to get back, to save themselves. For just a moment, Eliza saw the man who taught her to read, the man who'd pretended to care. Then she remembered Toby's body crumpling to the ground, and the moment of sympathy died. William Miller was trying to organize a bucket brigade, his voice from shouting, but there was no controlling this fire. It was beyond human intervention. Now, this was the land itself fighting back, rejecting the invasion, purging the theft. And then someone shouted, "The main house is burning." All eyes turned toward the Miller home. Flames were visible in the second-story windows, growing rapidly, feeding on expensive furniture and imported wallpaper and decades of accumulated wealth. The fire Eliza had set was spreading faster than the outdoor blaze. Confined spaces creating an oven effect that turned the house into a crematorium. "My documents," Thomas Miller screamed. He started running toward the house, his expensive suit jacket flapping behind him. "Everything's in the study, the deeds, the contracts, the money." Several men tried to stop him, but Thomas was beyond reason. He reached the front porch just as the first-floor windows exploded outward from the heat. Flames licked out like serpent tongues, tasting the fresh air. Eliza watched Thomas hesitate at the door, survival instinct finally breaking through greed. He stepped back away from the inferno, his face a mask of devastation. He'd lost everything. The oil well, the house, the money, the future. All of it consumed by fire in less than 30 minutes. But Eliza wasn't finished. She'd been moving through the chaos unnoticed as always, positioning herself carefully. Now she stood near the western tent, where the celebration dinner sat abandoned, where the tables still held glasses and plates and the remnants of a feast. The tent's canvas was stretched tight, held up by wooden poles and cotton ropes. Cotton rope burns very well. Eliza took a small jar of lamp oil from her pocket, the same oil that was currently destroying the Miller property on a massive scale. She poured it on the base of the nearest tent pole, then pulled a match from where she'd hidden it in her hair. The match was a risk. She'd stolen it 3 days ago and kept it dry through careful planning and luck. If it didn't light, if it had gotten damp, her final statement would fail. She struck the match against the sole of her shoe. It flared to life on the first try. The tent caught fire with surprising speed. The flames raced up the support poles, consumed the canvas ceiling, and within minutes, the white tent transformed into a massive bonfire. The guests, who'd been hovering nearby, uncertain whether to flee or stay, finally made their decision. They ran for the carriages, abandoning all pretense of helping or salvaging the situation. Eliza stood in the center of the chaos, surrounded by fire on all sides, and felt something she hadn't experienced in 4 months. Peace. The land was singing now, a deep thrumming song that only she could hear. It sang of justice. It sang of balance. It sang of the price that had to be paid when you built empires on stolen ground, and watered them with innocent blood. Thomas Miller finally saw her. He was standing near the burning house, covered in soot and ash, his expensive suit in tatters, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. His eyes found Eliza across the 50 yards of flaming property, and understanding dawned. "You," he whispered. Then louder, screaming over the roar of the flames, "You did this." Eliza met his gaze directly for the first time since Toby's murder. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't show any emotion at all. She simply stood there, a 17-year-old girl covered in soot and blood and 4 years of accumulated suffering, and let Thomas Miller see what he'd created. He started toward her, murder in his eyes, but William grabbed his arm. "Father, we need to go. The whole place is going to explode." He was right. There were 3 more storage tanks near the drilling site, each one filled with crude petroleum, each one heating up from the surrounding fires. When they went, the explosion would make the derrick look like a candle. Thomas Miller struggled against his son's grip. A robber joined William, and together they dragged their father toward the line of fleeing carriages. Margaret was already gone, fled with the first wave of panicked guests. The Miller family was abandoning their property, their celebration, their dreams of petroleum wealth. Eliza watched them go. Then she turned and walked in the opposite direction toward the eastern forest, toward the section of property where Toby's grave lay hidden. Behind her, the second wave of explosions began. The storage tanks ruptured one after another, each detonation sending new gouts of flame hundreds of feet into the air. The sound was continuous now, a rumbling roar like the earth itself was screaming. Eliza didn't look back. She walked steadily through the forest, the orange glow of the burning property lighting her way like a second sunset. She could feel the heat, even a Slade 4-mile distant, could smell the burning oil and wood and everything the Millers had accumulated. She reached Toby's grave just as the main house collapsed. The building had stood for 38 years, but it took less than 40 minutes to be reduced to ash in memory. The sound of its falling was almost musical, a great crash followed by an eruption of sparks that rose into the night sky like demonic fireflies. Eliza knelt beside her brother's grave and pulled the stolen documents from her pocket. The mineral rights claim, the false contract. She looked at them in the firelight. These papers that had meant everything to Thomas Miller, that represented ownership and control and legal authority. Then she tore them into small pieces and scattered them over Toby's resting place. "They don't own anything anymore," she whispered to the earth. "Not the land, not the oil, not us, never again us." The fires burned through the night and well into the next day. By the time they finally exhausted themselves, the Miller property was unrecognizable. The derricks were gone, reduced to charred stumps. The main house was a foundation filled with ash. The storage buildings, the celebration tents, the equipment, all of it consumed. The Pittsburgh investors lost approximately $80,000. Thomas Miller lost everything except his life and his family. The Crawford County Sheriff launched an investigation into the cause of the fire, but with all the documents destroyed and conflicting witness accounts, he concluded it was an industrial accident caused by negligence and poor safety standards. No one mentioned Eliza Brown. No one remembered seeing her during the chaos. In the official report, she didn't exist, which was exactly what she wanted. Eliza walked through the night, heading northeast toward Lake Erie, where she'd heard there were communities of freed people who helped runaways establish new lives. She carried nothing but the clothes on her back and a small cloth bag containing a piece of stone from Toby's grave. She never used the name Eliza Brown again. That girl died in a basement in Crawford County, her hope extinguished along with her brother's life. The woman who walked away from the burning Miller property chose a new name, one that meant something to her, though she never shared its significance with anyone. She made it to Erie by July 7th, half-starved and exhausted, but free. A Quaker family took her in, asked no questions, gave her food and rest and the space to heal what could be healed. She stayed with them for 6 weeks, working in their household and slowly remembering how to be human again. In late August, she made her way to Canada, crossing the border at Niagara Falls among a group of tourists. Once in Ontario, she disappeared into the community of Black expatriates who'd fled American slavery and racism. She worked as a laundress, then as a cook, then as a teacher in a small school for freed children. She never married, never had children of her own, but she raised dozens of orphans who had nowhere else to go, giving them the safety and dignity that had been stolen from her and Toby. She lived to be 73 years old, dying peacefully in her sleep in a house she owned and a community that respected her. The people who knew her described her as kind but distant, someone who carried old wounds that never fully healed. She never told anyone about the fire, never spoke of Pennsylvania or the Millers or the oil that could have made her rich if the world had been different. That story stayed locked inside her, a dark jewel of pain and vengeance that she carried alone until her last breath. But every year on July 4th, she would take the small stone from Toby's grave and hold it while the sunset painted the sky red and orange, and she would whisper the same words she'd spoken that night in the forest. They don't own anything anymore. Not the land, not the oil, not us. Never again us. The Miller family never recovered their fortune. Thomas tried to file insurance claims, but the investigation revealed his negligent safety practices and the companies refused to pay. He spent his remaining years as a bitter old man, working as a farm laborer for other people. His dreams of petroleum wealth reduced to cautionary tales told in taverns. Robert Miller died in 1873 from complications related to his war injury, never having married or achieved anything of significance. William drank himself to death by 1880. Margaret lived until 1891, a broken woman who spent her final years in a charity home for indigent widows. The property itself remained scarred for decades. Nothing grew properly in the oil-soaked soil. Future attempts at drilling found the underground reservoir fractured and depleted, rendered worthless by the catastrophic pressure release of July 4, 1869. Eventually, the land was abandoned, reverting to forests that grew strange and twisted over the poisoned earth. In the official histories of Pennsylvania's oil boom, there's no mention of the Miller Oil Company. It existed for barely 4 months and left no lasting legacy except ash and ruins. The disaster was considered too embarrassing to document in detail. A reminder that the rush for black gold often ended in black tragedy. But Eliza's story, though unrecorded in any official history, lived on in different ways. Among the communities of freed people, whispered tales circulated about a girl who'd found oil and used it as a weapon against her oppressors. The details changed with each telling embellished and mythologized, but the core remained. Sometimes justice doesn't come from courts or laws or the mercy of those in power. Sometimes it comes from fire. On July 4, 1942, exactly 73 years after the Miller property burned, a historian researching Pennsylvania's industrial history discovered a partially burned document in the Crawford County Archives. It was a fragment of a mineral rights claim dated March 20, 1869, listing Thomas Miller as the discoverer of petroleum deposits on his property. But someone had written across it in pencil in a careful hand that suggested recent education. He stole it. Her name was Eliza Brown, and he murdered her brother to keep the secret. July 3, 1869. The historian tried to investigate further, but found no records of anyone named Eliza Brown in Crawford County during that period. No birth certificates, no death records, no census data. It was as if she'd never existed at all. The historian included a footnote about the mysterious annotation in his published work, noting it as an unverified claim of unclear origin, possibly a later addition to the document. The footnote comprised exactly 3 sentences in a 400-page book. That footnote is the only official acknowledgement that Eliza Brown ever lived, ever suffered, ever fought back. 3 sentences buried in an academic text that fewer than 200 people ever read. But for those who understand what it means to be erased from history, those 3 sentences are enough. They prove that someone knew, someone remembered, someone made sure that Eliza's truth, however fragmentary, survived the fires that consumed everything else. The land where the Miller property once stood is now a nature preserve. The state of Pennsylvania purchased it in 1952 and designated it protected wilderness. Hikers occasionally explore the area, though they often report an uneasy feeling, a sense that the forest there is different from surrounding regions. The trees grow in strange patterns. Water that should run clear often has an iridescent sheen, and sometimes on summer evenings when the wind blows from the east, There's a smell like burning oil that has no source anyone can identify. The preserve rangers have a saying, "The land remembers what people forget." If you walk deep enough into those woods, past the marked trails and warning signs, you'll eventually come to a clearing where nothing grows. The soil is still toxic after more than a century, still bearing the scars of that July night when petroleum and fire and rage transformed theft into ashes. And if you listen carefully in that clearing, some say you can hear something, not quite a voice, not quite a song, but something like both rising from the earth itself, carrying the weight of stories that were never allowed to be told. Stories of people who discovered wealth and had it stolen. Stories of children murdered to protect secrets. Stories of vengeance that burned so hot it scarred the land for generations. Stories like Eliza Brown's. She never got her freedom the way she'd hoped. Never got to walk away with her brother into a future of their own making. Never got the justice that courts and laws were supposed to provide. But she got something else. Something that perhaps mattered more in the end. She made sure that the people who murdered Toby paid for it in the currency they valued most. Not their lives, but their wealth. Not their bodies, but their dreams. She destroyed their legacy so thoroughly that even their names are barely remembered, while her story, fragmented and mythologized as it is, continues to be whispered in the spaces between recorded history. On July 4, 1869, Eliza Brown didn't win her freedom, but she won her dignity. She refused to let the world pretend that her suffering and Toby's death meant nothing. She forced recognition through fire and destruction, writing her truth in ash across the Pennsylvania wilderness. The oil she discovered would have made the Millers rich for generations. Instead, it made one spectacular bonfire that people talked about in hushed tones for decades. A bonfire that announced to anyone paying attention that some thefts carry a price too high to pay, that some injustices create reactions too powerful to contain, that some 17-year-old girls, when pushed past the point of having anything left to lose, become forces of nature more destructive than any industrial accident. More than 150 years have passed since that night. The oil boom that defined Pennsylvania in the 1860s and 1870s is long over. The fields that once produced millions of barrels are depleted or abandoned. The wooden dirks have been replaced by modern machinery or collapsed into ruins. The men who made fortunes are dust, their money spent by grandchildren who never knew the source. But the land remains scarred, toxic, forever changed by what happened there, and Eliza's story remains too, surviving in footnotes and whispers and the uncomfortable truth that American progress was built on countless acts of theft that were met with countless acts of resistance, most of them lost to history, some of them preserved in flames hot enough to scar the earth. This is what we know for certain. On July 4th, 1869, the Miller Oil Company in Crawford County, Pennsylvania, experienced a catastrophic industrial accident that destroyed the entire operation and the family homestead. Multiple explosions and fires consumed the property. No lives were lost, but the financial devastation was complete. This is what the whispers claim. A girl named Eliza Brown found the oil that made the disaster possible. She offered the discovery in exchange for freedom. They murdered her brother instead, so she used the oil as a weapon, turning their greed into their downfall, their treasure into their destruction. This is what the land remembers. The ground beneath that nature preserve still bears the chemical signature of crude petroleum contamination from the 1869 fire. Soil samples show concentrations of hydrocarbons consistent with a massive release of crude oil, followed by combustion at extreme temperatures. The contamination pattern suggests deliberate rather than accidental distribution of flammable material. The land remembers it always does, long after people forget, long after records burn, long after official histories are written by those in power. The land keeps the truth preserved in its scarred soil and twisted trees and water that still smells faintly of the oil that should have brought prosperity, but instead brought fire. Eliza Brown walked away from that burning property carrying nothing but rage transformed into action. Grief transmuted into justice. She lived 54 more years, raising children who weren't hers, teaching lessons she'd learned in blood, carrying the weight of what she'd done without ever speaking of it aloud. Was it worth it? Did the destruction of the Miller fortune balance the scales against Toby's murder? Did the fires that consumed their dreams bring her any peace? These are questions without answers, questions that Eliza took to her grave in Ontario in 1923. But perhaps the real question isn't whether her vengeance was worth it. Perhaps the real question is what drives a person to such extremes. What kind of world creates situations where a 17-year-old girl's only path to dignity runs to fire and destruction? What systems of power and oppression push people to the point where burning everything down feels like the only honest response? Eliza Brown didn't choose to find that oil. She didn't choose to be enslaved illegally 4 years after emancipation. She didn't choose to have her brother murdered in front of her. All of those things were done to her by people who believed their power and whiteness gave them ownership over black bodies and black futures. What she did choose was to make them pay for it, to refuse the role of passive victim, to transform from broken girl to avenging force, to write her truth and fire across the Pennsylvania wilderness. And in making that choice, she ensured that her story, fragmented as it is, survived. The Millers wanted to erase her to use her discovery while pretending she never existed, but you can't erase someone who burns bright enough to scar the earth. Eliza Brown existed. She suffered. She discovered wealth. She was betrayed. She lost everything that mattered, and then she made sure that the people who destroyed her lost everything too. This is her story pieced together from footnotes and whispers and the memories that land keeps when people refuse to. This is the truth that survived the fires that outlasted the oil boom that endures in the spaces between official histories. Remember her name, Eliza Brown. 17 years old in 1869, enslaved illegally, discoverer of oil, sister to Toby, survivor of betrayal, architect of vengeance, free woman who walked away from the ashes of everything her oppressors valued, carrying nothing but her dignity and the satisfaction of watching their empire burn. The land remembers, the whispers continue, and somewhere in the twisted forest that grew over the Miller property, in the soil too toxic for normal growth, in the water that still shimmers with petroleum rainbow, Eliza's truth remains. They don't own anything anymore, not the land, not the oil, not us, never again.